smashing every expectation, every action's an act of creation. I'm laughing in the face of casualties of sorrow. For the first time I'm thinking past tomorrow.
Gotta love that song. Lin-Manuel Miranda put his favorite founding father on the map with that Broadway hit. It was called Hamilton. We know all about it. But what about some of the lesser-known characters from the Revolutionary era? Well, the author of a new book argues that one in particular deserves to be remembered, a doctor and signer of the Declaration who championed progressive causes that remain topical today.
Benjamin Rush was, first of all, sort of the founding father that people haven't found yet.
But author Stephen Freed thinks it's high time America did. With good reason.
He had very quietly helped write the proclamation that set off the Boston Tea Party. He had written one of the first major abolition writings, and basically within 2 years of the Continental Congress coming to Philadelphia, he was in the Continental Congress, and he was signing the Declaration of Independence at the age of 30.
So this is the good Dr. Rush?
This is the good Dr. Rush.
Freed spent 5 years writing his biography, having at his disposal Rush's own autobiography and diaries, housed at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia.
He writes in about the year 1774, a certain Thomas Paine arrived in Philadelphia. So this is Rush beginning to tell the story of how he met Thomas Paine, who was just a local writer. They talked about writing about independence, which Rush considered to be a very dangerous thing, to even write the word independence. He actually decided that he would encourage Paine to write the pamphlet about independence that he had already started. When the pamphlet was done, Rush convinced him to call it Common Sense.
So all of this would have been served here at the tavern. The doctor dined here at City Tavern with his much more famous co-conspirators, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, even George Washington. So how pivotal would you say Dr. Rush was to the American Revolution?
I would say, first of all, that I think that everything he did is so far not really well understood. But I think that the key to the American Revolution is that all these people work together. People forget that when Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, Rush was writing the Declaration of Independence for Pennsylvania, and each state was declaring its own independence. So this was a group effort.
But he was one of the few signers of the Declaration who, in fact, rushed to the front lines.
What's wonderful is that he's there talking to Washington the night before they're about to cross the Delaware. And he writes about all this. So a lot of the way we know that Washington was holding a little slip of paper that said victory or death is because it's in Rush's journal.
After independence was won, Rush refocused his fight against slavery. How much of slavery impacted his legacy?
Well, interestingly so, he wrote one of the first of the Founding Father writings on slavery, against slavery. He owned a slave for about 10 years after the war. We have really no idea why. There's been speculation that he bought a slave because some abolitionists bought slaves to free them. I couldn't find enough evidence that that's why he did it to say that. The abolition movement kind of stopped during the war. It picked up again in the later 1780s. When it did, Rush freed his slave.
But for all of his influence, Rush hasn't found celebrity the way some other founding fathers have.
The first time I'm thinking past tomorrow.
Should Lin-Manuel have written Hamilton?
About Rush?
About Rush.
Absolutely. Rush was a much better, more interesting person than Hamilton. If he wants to come back to do Rush, Rush was so much a part of the founding of the helping of the founding of the Black church in America that he could do Rush in gospel. I think Rush was a better person. I think if you asked Hamilton, he would have said Rush was a better person. Every person who comes to Rush says, why isn't this guy more famous? What I found out in looking at not only his writing, but what happened after he died, is that there was a concerted effort to keep what was most interesting about Rush from the public.
Why?
Well, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had written Rush some of the most incredibly personal letters they ever shared with any of them, hundreds of them. So Rush was kind of the founding father who knew too much. His legacy was sort of slowly quashed. Part of it is because Rush had an interestingly contentious relationship with George Washington. He didn't want his family to know that he and Washington had had this thing.
What was that thing?
At the very lowest ebb of the war, in the early 1778. Some of the generals were talking about whether Washington was making the right decisions in who he was deputizing as his generals. And he wrote an anonymous letter to Patrick Henry in which he mirrored some of these arguments. It's so exciting in a way because you think of it as like an email you shouldn't have sent. Because he actually sent Patrick Henry this letter in January. He asked him to burn it. He and Washington then kind of made up. And Patrick Henry sent the letter to Washington 2 months later. I don't know what it did to Washington, except it made him mad at Rush. And he remained upset with Rush about this through his life. These combination of things led the family to try to make sure that the most interesting things that Rush wrote, that people didn't see them.
Rush's true legacy thrives here.
This is the famous surgical amphitheater of Pennsylvania Hospital.
His passion was personal. His son John descended into mental illness after killing his best friend in a duel and was treated here for decades.
Late in his life, Rush wrote another public letter saying, these are the things we need to do to dramatically improve care for the mentally ill. So he brought the fact that John was there into the public, into the newspapers, because he was so intent on advocating for the rights of the mentally ill, for their diagnosis, for their dignity, and for a lack of discrimination against them.
For Stephen Fried, resurrecting the most significant founding father we've never heard of is more relevant now than ever.
There's a reason they use the phrase more perfect union. No one thought it was perfect. And part of what I love about Rush's writing, he's really trying to point out the things about America that are gonna be hard. Racial prejudice, having science and religion live together, having liberty and good government live together. And so he wrote about these things in a way that I think is still thoughtful today and makes you realize that these issues are hardwired into the American experiment, which we are still in.
And you really got to think about this. He was a true accidental founding father because, you know, people don't realize that when the Declaration, the last stop was Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the original guy who was supposed to sign it refused. It was too dangerous. Yeah. And so then Rush said, I'll do it. Yeah.
I'm in for Rush the Gospel.
I got to tell you, I'm reading this book. It's fascinating. It just he keeps being involved in more and more interesting things. When the yellow fever gripped Philadelphia, I think it was in the 1790s, he was one of the few doctors and stayed and treated people.
Stayed and treated people. Lost his sister.
Yep, amazing life and fascinating book.